This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Throughout the 1990s, Star Trek was in a golden age. Multiple hit television shows, a slate of feature films, and a vast worldwide fanbase. But by the early 2000s, things had changed. Pop culture had apparently left Star Trek behind, with Star Trek Nemesis a box office bomb, and Star Trek Enterprise dying a slow death on its fledgling network. While a loyal but small group of fans continued to appreciate the franchise, it was effectively dead for wider audiences. But for the powers that be, Star Trek wasn't dead, it was merely resting. It was inevitable the franchise would someday return, and when it did so with a bang. Following the cancellation of Star Trek Enterprise in 2005, the Star Trek franchise quickly faded into obscurity. Attractions like Star Trek The Experience closed its doors, the official Star Trek magazine was discontinued, and the official Star Trek website was left to wither. The only remaining new Star Trek releases came in the form of the quite brilliant post-Nemesis continuity novels. While they were made bestsellers thanks to fans, few others paid them any attention. However, even in this environment, some veteran cast and crew, as well as some newcomers, believed they had the winning idea for the next Star Trek installment. Producer-writer Rick Berman, the de facto head of Star Trek since the 90s, worked with writer Eric Jenderson to develop a new feature film project titled Star Trek The Beginning. This film would follow a new set of characters, including James Kirk's ancestor Tiberius Chase, during the Earth-Romulan War, set just after Enterprise. However, Rick Berman's association with both Nemesis and Enterprise meant studio execs simply weren't interested in any more Star Trek led by him, and so they passed on the project and Berman moved on from the franchise. Jonathan Frakes proposed a television show following Riker and Troy aboard the USS Titan, and Michael Dorn attempted to get the ball rolling on a Captain Worf series. Paramount turned both proposals down. David Rossi, Doug Mirabello, and Jose Munzo pushed for Star Trek to continue as an animated show titled Star Trek Final Frontier, but this never got off the ground. Christopher McQuarrie, Brian Singer, and Robert Meyer Burnett created a pitch for Star Trek Federation, a new series set in the year 3000 following a new crew aboard a new Enterprise setting out to save a weakened Federation from collapse. However, this pitch never made it to Paramount. One of the most fascinating unmade ideas came from famed Babylon 5 creator J. Michael Straczynski. Straczynski proposed a full reboot of Star Trek set in an alternate timeline. His concept reimagined Star Trek as a hard sci-fi series, which would apparently completely rethink the setting, technology, characters, and look of the wider universe. It's unclear just how far this idea got in development, but it was also never picked up. A large obstacle to anyone attempting to get their own Star Trek show off the ground was the corporate reshuffling underway with Paramount Pictures. The details of this reshuffling are extremely complex, but what's most relevant is Paramount's owner, Viacom, separating from the newly formed CBS Corporation, which was a different entity to the CBS Corporation which had originally created the first incarnation of Viacom back in the 1950s, and as I said, it's complicated. But the consequences for Star Trek were the television and feature film rights becoming split between Paramount Pictures and CBS Corporation. However, despite everything that had happened to the Star Trek franchise in the early 2000s, many executives at Paramount still saw Star Trek as their crown jewel property. Gail Berman, no relation to Rick Berman, then president of Paramount, was able to convince CBS to give Paramount 18 months to develop a brand new Star Trek movie. Otherwise, Paramount would lose the film rights. Another major obstacle to getting new Star Trek made was its pop culture image at the time.
Good one. That's pretty strong words for Trekkie.
Okay, well, Trekkie is derogatory at this point in the game. Trekker is what we're called now. Trekker.
Although properties like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and many superheroes had been lighting up the box office, Star Trek, for whatever reason, was still regarded as something far too nerdy for the mainstream. It was seen by many as a cheap and slow series, more concerned with technobabble and philosophical monologues than telling an emotionally gripping story or thrilling viewers with action. Of course, anyone who had actually watched Star Trek knew this wasn't the case, but the image of a Trekkie as a basement-dwelling social outcast stuck. Any new Star Trek project needed to shake off this image if it was to avoid the same fate as Nemesis or Enterprise. Star Trek needed to feel fresh and exciting. For lack of a better word, Star Trek needed to be cool, and to achieve this goal, the franchise needed new blood. To this end, Gail Berman approached writing duo Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci to write the screenplay. The two had become a hot commodity in Hollywood after Steven Spielberg had tapped them to write the highly anticipated Transformers movie, and the two had also written Paramount's then recent hit, Mission Impossible 3. When the two writers expressed interest, Berman, Orci, and Kurtzman also approached Mission Impossible 3's director J.J. Abrams to produce the next Star Trek. In contrast to the likes of Rick Berman and Brannon Braga, figures like J.J. Abrams were seen as absolutely having their fingers on the day's cultural pulse. Abrams had worked his way up through television, creating, writing, and producing, in part or in whole, hit shows like Felicity, Alias, and Lost through his Bad Robot production company. He landed the director's chair on Mission Impossible 3 purely because Tom Cruise was a fan of Alias. Initially, he joined Star Trek only in a producer role to help Kurtzman and Orci, enlisting the help of his longtime collaborators Damon Lindelof and Brian Burke. While Orci, Kurtzman, and Lindelof were already fans of Star Trek, Abrams and Burke were only vaguely familiar with it. Just like previous newcomers Nicholas Meyer and Harve Bennett, they were certainly aware of Star Trek, but had never really clicked with the actual shows or movies. Therefore, in developing this new Star Trek film, the team's goal was to fashion a story which would appeal to all of them. If they all liked an idea, they believed they were on the right track to satisfying long-term fans and casual viewers alike. Early in development, the creative team decided to bring back the iconic trio of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, as it was thought they were the most recognizable Star Trek characters for general audiences, albeit played by new actors. As far back as 1968, the idea of a prequel story depicting the first meeting of these three characters was proposed by Gene Roddenberry. Later, Harve Bennett conceived of a similar idea during development of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. While this idea was rejected at the time, it seemed to be the right direction to go in for this new movie. Expanding upon this, the team decided to set this new movie and its possible sequels in an alternate timeline. Either by direct inspiration or pure coincidence, the motivation to do this was identical to J. Michael Straczynski's own reasoning: to preserve the continuity of the previous shows and movies, but have enough creative freedom to do something new. To establish this new continuity, Orci and Kurtzman settled on a time travel plot, which would create this new reality. Though they acknowledged time travel had been overdone in later Star Trek, they saw it as essential in sidestepping the prequel problem, where the audience already knows the outcome of events. Their primary inspirations from previous Star Trek were episodes like Balance of Terror and Yesterday's Enterprise, as well as the movie The Wrath of Khan. For more in-depth details, however, the duo also took inspiration from Star Trek novels Prime Directive, Spock's World, and Best Destiny. These novels provided the names for Kirk's parents, George and Winona. The novels also helped justify the choice to depict the Enterprise being built on Earth, with Technobabble explaining the ship's artificial gravity and inertial dampening needing to be calibrated while inside a gravity well. This image of the Enterprise being built on Earth was largely inspired by a piece of fan art which Orci had sent to Abrams. The image demonstrated to Abrams how the Star Trek universe could feel grounded and realistic. Abrams also envisioned the shot of a young Kirk watching the Enterprise being built in Iowa as this film's equivalent of Luke Skywalker staring at the twin suns on Tatooine. By 2007, with the script nearing completion, Paramount offered Abrams the director's chair, which he gladly accepted. Though he wasn't a fan when he joined the project, since then he had binged many episodes and movies, feeling he had finally got Star Trek as an adult, where he had missed it as a child. He said, "After reading the script, I would be so agonizingly envious of whoever stepped in and directed the movie. I didn't love Kirk and Spock when I began this journey, but I love them now." This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the only tool you'll need to create a beautiful looking website for your business, portfolio, or online store. I used it to create my production company's website, and I didn't know the first thing about coding. I just found a template that worked for me and customized it using simple drag and drop tools. And now the process is even easier thanks to design intelligence. By combining 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise and cutting-edge AI technology, you can have a brand new website up and running literally within minutes. Everything from finding a template to integrating SEO can be personally tailored to your needs. Jump over to Squarespace using the link below to start building your website and use the coupon code RowanJColeman for 10% off your first purchase. Another longtime Abrams collaborator, Scott Chambliss, was brought on board as production designer. Chambliss hired a number of concept artists to help create the look of the film, including Ryan Church and Star Trek veteran John Eves. Ryan Church was the primary artist responsible for the new look of the USS Enterprise. Abrams told Church he wanted to keep the overall shape of the ship, but make it sleeker, like a hot rod version of the iconic vessel. To this end, Church made the design less strictly modular than Matt Jeffrey's original design, instead blending the saucer section, engineering hull, and warp nacelles into each other a little more. Church also took inspiration from both the original series and motion picture designs. He used the larger cylindrical nacelles of the original design, replete with spinning rotors inside the Bussard collectors. He also adjusted the deflector to retain the radar dish-like shape of the original design. However, the silvery grey colour of the hull and the panelling details was taken from the motion picture refit design. For the interiors of the ship, Chambliss chose to keep the overall layout of the bridge, but with brighter colours to reflect the optimism of Star Trek. He also changed the view screen to a floor-to-ceiling window, which images would be projected onto to make the outer space environment feel more tangible. While some Apple Store comparisons were made, the primary aesthetic influence was artist Pierre Cardin's famous work on 2001: A Space Odyssey. In contrast to the other areas of the ship, the engineering seen in the Enterprise is much more industrial. Abrams was heavily inspired by the RMS Titanic, a sleek, luxurious-looking ship with an incredible gut, in his words. Costume designer Michael Kaplan and prop master Russell Bobbitt also updated the uniforms, tricorders, and phasers. According to Abrams, this was a tremendous challenge, saying, "We all have an iPhone which can do more than the communicator. I feel like there's a certain thing you can't really hold on to, which is kind of the kitschy quality. That must go if it's something that you believe is real." To this end, Bobbitt collaborated with Nokia to create a new communicator. The tricorder was reduced in size, and the phasers were given a spring-loaded mechanism which would spin the barrel when switching from stun to kill. To avoid the pajama look sometimes associated with the original uniforms, Kaplan added in more fine detail by having the Starfleet emblem patterned onto the material and the rank insignia stripes made up of silver and gold. For the Romulans, they were envisioned as space pirates in contrast to the pristine Starfleet ships and characters. For the Narada, Chambliss was heavily inspired by architect Antoni Gaudi, making the ship seem as if it was made up of bones and ligaments, a working industrial ship as opposed to the presentable exploratory Enterprise. For the Romulans themselves, it was decided to return to the look of the original series, minus the forehead V-shape seen in the Next Generation. Complementing the pirate motif, the Romulans were given facial tattoos and tattered clothing. Finding new, younger actors to take over from such icons was no doubt an unenviable assignment. However, first and foremost, the team needed Leonard Nimoy. The team had all agreed if Nimoy turned down the offer, they would delay filming and rewrite the script. Before production, they met with Nimoy at his house, explaining their vision for the film, but also how much Nimoy himself meant to them. When the filmmakers left, Nimoy allegedly remained in his chair for some time, overwhelmed with emotion. He recalled, "This was the first and only time I had ever had a filmmaker tell me, 'We cannot make this without you, and we won't make it without you.' The script had me genuinely excited by its scope and the details of the characters, especially Spock. We have dealt with Spock's being half human, half Vulcan, but never with quite the overview that this script has of the entire history of the character, the growth of the character, and the arrival of the character into the Enterprise crew." After some careful consideration, Nimoy was happy to reprise his most famous character. For the villainous role of Nero, Australian actor Eric Bana landed the part. He was an enormous fan of Star Trek the original series and was thrilled to be part of the production. While Bana got his start in comedy dramas like The Castle and Chopper, he was a familiar face to blockbuster audiences at the time, having appeared in Black Hawk Down, Hulk and Troy, as well as the thriller Munich. In the role of Christopher Pike, the captain of the Enterprise before Kirk, Canadian actor Bruce Greenwood was cast. His casting was largely influenced by his performance as John F. Kennedy in the 2000 film 13 Days. It was believed Greenwood could bring a 60s swagger, but also a much-needed gravitas to the role. Additional cast members included Ben Cross as Spock's father Sarek, and Winona Ryder as Spock's mother Amanda. Kirk's parents were played by a pre-Thor Chris Hemsworth and Jennifer Morrison. To play Pavel Chekhov, Russian-born American actor Anton Yelchin was cast. Although according to Yelchin, Chekhov's tendency of mixing up V's and W's is something more common with Polish accents, he chose to retain that trait for his performance, though the rest of his accent was more inspired by his parents.
What I loved about Chekhov is that he's so weird. Like, he's to me, is the weirdest member of the crew. There's an episode where they go to a planet, it's called the Apple. Everyone's doing work, and Chekhov spends pretty much the entire episode macking on his girlfriend.
Before Star Trek, Anton Yelchin had already made an impression as the lead in the drama film Hearts of Atlantis, as well as appearing as a regular in the series Huff. Yelchin would later go on to act opposite Patrick Stewart in the thriller Green Room. For the role of Hikaru Sulu, Heroes actor James Kyson Lee expressed interest, but Abrams was instead leaning towards casting Korean-American actor John Cho. At first, Abrams was unsure about casting a Korean-American to play a Japanese-American, but George Takei gave the casting his blessing, and so Cho landed the part. Up until Star Trek, Cho was mainly known as a comedic actor, famously one half of the Harold and Kumar duo. However, he also won acclaim in indie films such as Yellow and Better Luck Tomorrow. He saw his role as Sulu as a great opportunity to branch out into action and trained for 2 months to do justice to Sulu's knack for fencing from the original series. English actor Simon Pegg had already worked with J.J. Abrams in Mission Impossible 3 and was offered the role of Montgomery Scott via email. Pegg, being an unabashed Trekkie, jumped at the chance. For the character's accent, Pegg drew inspiration from his Scottish wife Maureen and the film's own assistant director Tommy Gormley, both from Glasgow. Although James Doohan originally based his accent on Aberdeen, Pegg believed achieving an East Coast accent was more within his grasp. As a Scottish person myself, I think his accent is pretty good. Simon Pegg got his start in British comedy shows like Big Train before starring in Spaced, which he co-created with Jessica Stevenson. He made his break into feature films with the Edgar Wright-directed Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, completing the acclaimed Cornetto trilogy in The World's End, and he continues to appear in the Mission Impossible series to this day. Sidney Tamia Poitier had auditioned for Uhura, but Abrams was more keen on Zoe Saldana for the character. Saldana had never seen Star Trek but was intrigued by the offer and met with Nichelle Nichols to discuss the character.
I really wanted to do it justice because Nichelle Nichols was just amazing. I was very nervous to meet her because she's such a pioneer for what she's done for women in Hollywood. I remember feeling my heart pounding because I just didn't know what she was going to expect of me or demand of me. And it was completely the opposite. She was just so happy and honored. I'm like, ma'am, this is such an honor to meet you. Like, this is amazing what you did, the doors that you opened. And people like me walked right through it, and now I'm able to say that I am a part of you.
This is a fun experience for you.
Fun is a too small a word. It's eerie and exciting. I've just been sitting there all that time talking to myself. Zoe Saldana, beautiful child.
Up until this point, the character's first name had never been revealed, and so Roberto Orci suggested Nyota, meaning star in Swahili, first used by William Roster in his 1982 book Star Trek II Biographies. Another crucial element in this new version of the character was her romantic relationship with Spock, inspired by a number of scenes in the original series in which Uhura and Spock flirt with one another.
Tell me how your planet Vulcan looks on a lazy evening when the moon is full.
Vulcan has no moon, Miss Uhura.
I'm not surprised, Mr. Spock.
Saldana had steady work in the early to mid-2000s in various films and television shows, but often the projects she landed were not box office hits. This is with the exception of Pirates of the Caribbean: Curse of the Black Pearl, in which she played Anna Maria, and the Steven Spielberg-directed drama The Terminal, where she played, funnily enough, a Trekkie. Apparently Steven Spielberg was the one who taught her how to do the Vulcan salute. The same year Star Trek saw its release, Saldana also portrayed Neytiri in James Cameron's Avatar, and more recently she joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Gamora. New Zealand actor Carl Urban actively pursued the role of Dr. McCoy when he first heard of the part. Urban had been a huge Star Trek fan since he was 7 years old. He was already familiar with Orci and Kurtzman, as they had both worked on Xena Warrior Princess, in which Urban portrayed both Cupid and Julius Caesar. He was offered the role after only his first audition. Urban had won great acclaim in New Zealand for his comedic performance in The Price of Milk and his dramatic performance in Out of the Blue. His break into Hollywood came following his appearance as Éomer in The Lord of the Rings, after which he landed villainous roles in The Bourne Supremacy and The Chronicles of Riddick. Similarly, Zachary Quinto also pursued the role of Spock, stating his interest in the role in a newspaper interview which Abrams was made aware of. Quinto found the character of Spock truly fascinating. During his audition, Quinto got into character by wearing a blue shirt, taping his fingers together to practice the Vulcan salute, shaved his eyebrows into shape, and dyed his hair. He also worked in several physical characteristics from Nimoy's performance, such as holding his hands behind his back and his perfect posture. Although Academy Award winner Adrian Brody was also considered, Quinto eventually won the role. Zachary Quinto worked steadily as a guest star and recurring star in numerous television shows such as CSI, Charmed, and 24, but he shot to stardom as the superpowered serial killer Sylar in Heroes. At the time he auditioned for Star Trek, he was aware Leonard Nimoy had casting approval, and so was enthused to know he had won the role with Nimoy's blessing, and the two would strike up a close personal friendship during production. William Shatner also had casting approval for the new James T. Kirk. Names that were considered included Mike Vogel, Ryan Gosling, Sam Rockwell, and Joshua Jackson. Matt Damon was often rumoured to be a frontrunner, but the actor has since said he was never actually approached for the part. Eventually, the actor who won Shatner's and the filmmaker's approval was Chris Pine. However, he described his first audition as awful. Thankfully, J.J. Abrams never saw this audition and was convinced by Pine's agent to see his second audition, which he did with Quinto. The two already knew each other as they worked out at the same gym. Only after Pine received a written approval from William Shatner did he secure the role. Pine's early career is characterized by romantic lead roles, such as in The Princess Diaries 2 and Just My Luck. However, his far more interesting work can be seen in the action film Smokin' Aces, where he portrays a psychopathic hitman. What won him early praise, though, was his stage work in both Los Angeles and New York, which he continues to do frequently to this day.
I won't lie, it's been incredibly overwhelming to step into the role that Mr. Shatner created. It is such an iconic, specific role in like the canon of film and TV history. I talked to JJ about it in the beginning of the process, and we kind of made a mutual decision that it would be a mistake to try to recreate what Mr. Shatner had done and to kind of forge a new path. And there's certain qualities of Kirk that you can't ignore and that it is in the character. But to try to mimic Mr. Shatner would just be a mistake.
Filming began on the 7th of November 2007, utilizing locations throughout California as well as Paramount Studios. Abrams and director of photography Dan Mindell chose to shoot the movie on 35mm film with anamorphic lenses as opposed to digital cameras. A visual trademark the movie would become famous for was the abundance of lens flares. This was a deliberate choice by Abrams and Mindell as a visual signifier of Star Trek's optimism, but also an attempt to make the setting feel real. The frame is literally bright, but the hustle and bustle of other activity is implied off-screen using the flares. On location, the production used the ever-reliable Vasquez rocks, as well as the San Rafael swell to stand in for Vulcan, while the Sky Rose Chapel was used for interiors set on Vulcan. California State University stood in for Starfleet Academy, with some CG set extensions and backdrops. And finally, Bakersfield, California stood in for Iowa. While the vast majority of the Enterprise interiors were built as sets at Paramount Studios, for the industrial look of engineering, the production shot at a Budweiser beer plant in Van Nuys, California. Although a conscious effort was made to avoid the heavy reuse and redressing of sets common with previous Star Trek productions, the bridge set for the USS Kelvin was redressed as the training simulator at Starfleet Academy. To prevent the story leaks which plagued previous Star Trek productions, security was extremely strict during filming. Some actors were only given portions of the script relevant to their character, and any script reading done while on set had to be in the presence of a security guard. Principal photography wrapped on the 27th of March 2008. For the film's visual effects, the production once again enlisted the services of Industrial Light and Magic, complemented by Digital Domain and some other smaller vendors. This was the first film ILM worked on to use entirely digital spaceships. Even ILM's work on the Star Wars prequel trilogy utilized miniatures for several ships. While Ryan Church had designed the new Enterprise, visual effects supervisor Roger Guyot added in some moving parts to the ship to make it more dynamic. When going to warp, for example, the deflector dish opens up and the fins on the nacelles split open. For the music of the film, Abrams hired his frequent collaborator Michael Giacchino to create the film's score. Unlike Abrams, Giacchino was a Star Trek fan and grew up listening to the music of the shows and movies, and so took a personal pleasure in scoring Star Trek. However, rather than bringing back the Jerry Goldsmith or James Horner theme, Giacchino decided to create an original theme, complemented by Alexander Courage's original series theme, but reorchestrated. For the Vulcan-related music, Giacchino used an erhu played by Karen Han to lend the Vulcans a sense of age, wisdom, but also subtle emotion. The Romulans, in contrast, were propelled by large blasts of brass and distorted strings. All in all, the score required a 107-piece orchestra and a 40-person choir. Spirits were high, and many in the cast and crew hoped their hard work would finally pay off and Star Trek would be a hit.
I've had a great time, and I have not been looking forward to this day. And I think you've got a wonderful movie here, and I think from the top on down, everybody has just been fantastic. I think you're a great, great bunch of talented people, committed, and it's just been a very, very rich and wonderful experience for me. It's 18 years since the last time I played Spock. 18 years, hard to believe. And it's 42 years since I first started. So it means a lot to me to be here with all of you people tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you.
To pull back the curtain a little bit here, when this movie came out, I was only 14 years old and lived here, a remote village in the Scottish Highlands called Kinlochleven. For the longest time, our closest cinema was about an hour's drive away in the nearby town of Fort William. However, that cinema had closed down a few years earlier, and so the next closest cinema was in the town Oban, which was roughly a 3-hour round trip to see anything there. But like the Fort William cinema, that cinema in Oban also closed down. The next closest cinema was over 2 hours drive away, which meant an over 4-hour round trip. My family didn't have a hell of a lot of money, and so those trips were pretty costly. As much as I would have liked, I resigned myself to having to wait until the new Star Trek came out on DVD to see it. But a few months after its wide release, I heard the Screen Machine was coming to the village. It's this truck which drives around remote areas in Scotland and unfolds into a cinema. The last time the Screen Machine visited Kinlochleven, I was only about 5 or 6 years old, and to my delight, this time the Screen Machine was showing Star Trek. It's only a small cinema screen, maybe twice as big as those projection screens sometimes used in schools, but that didn't really matter. I went to see the film with my mum, who's also a huge Trekkie. I got my popcorn and my fizzy drink and sat down to see the new movie. Star Trek was always something I had grown up loving. I was introduced to it at such an early age. I don't even know what the first episode or movie I watched was. We collected the fact files, bought second-hand videotapes from charity shops, and so on, but there was always a slight sadness in that Star Trek was largely something that was before my time. The only Star Trek show which began and ended during my lifetime back then was Enterprise, and we didn't have UPN in the UK, so I only ever saw the first episode of that show on a second-hand VHS tape. I was barely aware of the show's existence before it was cancelled. After a lifetime of loving the adventures of the Starship Enterprise, visiting strange new worlds, encountering strange new life, seeing Captain Kirk having dust-ups with giant lizards, Picard making passionate moral arguments, and really being instilled with a sense of wonder about the universe and optimism for the future, finally, there was a new Star Trek and I would get to see it on the big screen. The lights dimmed in the Screen Machine and the movie started. By the time the title card faded in, I already loved the movie. I know this will be somewhat of a hot take for some people, and we'll get to that, but for me, Star Trek 2009 is easily one of the best movies in the entire series. I love its sense of adventure, the sense of fun, the familiar characters given new spins by new actors, the emotional sincerity, the themes of friendship, living up to one's potential, and seeing the full scope of the Star Trek universe like never before. In contrast to the previous big screen outings where Paramount had tight control over the budget, here they threw $150 million behind this movie, and it really shows. As much as I love many of the older Star Trek films, this was the first to really do justice to the word blockbuster. The visual effects are simply stunning. But beyond the level of technical artistry on display, there's so much that I just really love about the visual style of this movie. I do really like this version of the Enterprise. I remember being kind of thrown by it when I first saw it all those years ago, but I've come to regard it as one of my favourites. I certainly have some quibbles with it, but the detailing is gorgeous, the silhouette is striking, and it looks terrific in motion. I like the bridge design well enough, and most of the Enterprise, Starfleet vessel interiors in general, but I don't think engineering quite works. I love the concept of a more industrial, stripped down gut for the ship, but somehow I feel like there's a bit too much concrete on this spaceship. And I know this may be another hot take, but I love the lens flares. The creative intention for why there are so many really works in my opinion. Even in the darkest of locations, the lens flares add a lot of light to the image and succeed in implying a larger, brighter universe off screen. I can understand why it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I personally think it really works. I also love the sense of energy J.J. Abrams always lends to his films. His direction can certainly be quite sloppy at times with this awkward blend between Spielbergian long takes and Michael Bay dynamism, but after decades of Star Trek movies which were all shot in mostly the same very good traditional way with little variation, here J.J. Abrams just uses more tools. I especially love the way the bridge is shot, with sliding dolly shots linked together by whip pans, the use of handheld camera during action scenes, and all the Dutch angles. I don't think all of it works, in fact quite a lot of it is simply flashy for the sake of being flashy, but then again, why can't Star Trek be flashy for a change? At least it's an attempt at trying something new, which I think is very commendable. Michael Giacchino's score is much more traditional by comparison, but also brilliant. The original theme he created for the movie gets instantly stuck in your head when it's first played in the opening. It succeeds in capturing that Alexander Courage style of heavy brass and sharp percussion for the action sequences. The reorchestration of the original series theme mixed in with the new is brilliant. The best the original theme has ever sounded by far. I also enjoy the smaller flourishes like the use of the Erhu for Vulcan, and the use of choir transports the viewer to that fantastical world of Star Trek with ease. It's comfortably one of the best Star Trek movie scores ever made. The cast are all pretty much spot on. While Kirk and Spock take center stage, Bones, Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov, and Scotty all get plenty to do, with each one of them having some kind of standout moment in the film. John Cho is awesome as this quiet, badass version of Sulu. Playing up Chekhov's intellect and youth makes him such a fun and quirky presence. Zoe Saldana is honestly too good an actress for how much screen time Uhura gets, but that just makes her scenes all the more memorable. Simon Pegg is a little cartoonish in places, but he's an expert in being comic relief without being irritating. And Carl Urban is a revelation as McCoy. Spot on comedic timing, but with a grittiness and gravitas which prevents his performance from being a caricature. I especially like the origin story of his nickname.
Yeah, well, I got nowhere else to go. The ex-wife took the whole damn planet in the divorce. All I got left is my bones.
This portrayal of James T. Kirk, though, does go overboard at times. As mentioned earlier, there was definitely a feeling of Star Trek needing to reinvent itself as cool for wider audiences, and while the faster pace and action succeeded in that regard, the cool elements worked into Kirk's character are a little cringeworthy. Stealing his stepfather's antique sports car, his flirtation with Uhura, and the entire underwear scene, these do feel very out of place and quite gratuitous. That being said, Kirk's arrogance and cockiness is totally in line with what we've previously heard about Kirk in his younger years. This is a Kirk who isn't weighed down by the burden of command yet. He hasn't had time to fully mature as the starship captain we all know him as. And so I think Chris Pine's performance definitely works, but the writing for the character is shallow in some scenes. Which is why, just like in the original series, Kirk is largely upstaged by Spock in this movie. Zachary Quinto is just excellent in the role. Taking over from an icon like Leonard Nimoy, Nimoy must have been very intimidating, but to actually share a scene with him is a dangerous prospect, and yet Quinto more than holds his own. Just like Kirk, this is Spock in his younger years. The conflict between his Vulcan and human halves is much more prevalent. Quinto plays the subtextual emotions of the character exceedingly well, lending real power to his outbursts of anger and grief. His story really is the heart of the film. I always get a little choked up when Sarek says this to Spock.
You asked me once why I married your mother. I married her because I loved her.
Which is why the interplay between these two characters works so well in the film. In a way, they represent each other's personal struggles. Kirk is the human side of Spock, impulsive, arrogant, and reckless, whereas Spock is the ideal Starfleet officer many expect Kirk to be, dutiful, intelligent, and responsible. Their journey from enemies to friends symbolizes them overcoming their own struggles and finding strength in their weaknesses. Kirk's to hell with the odds attitude shows Spock how to embrace the passion of his human side to better utilize his intelligence and expertise. Whereas Spock's ideal Starfleet officer presence shows Kirk what he could become if he strives to be something more than he is. You really get a sense of why these two need each other, and how they become such good friends later down the line. That being said, although these arcs work in general, the plotting to get them to where they need to be can be very contrived. Captain Pike promoting Kirk from cadet to first officer because he remembered a thing from a Starfleet report made years ago is pretty ridiculous. It only happens so Kirk can take command when Spock steps down. The latter plot point is fine, but it's a big leap to get there. What I appreciate most about the storytelling in this Star Trek is how daring it is. I said before in my Enterprise review how the temporal Cold War arc came across as toothless. We're told established events are being altered, but because we aren't familiar with these specific events, and nothing that huge happens to the timeline, we don't get a sense of the stakes. But in Star Trek 2009, the destruction of Vulcan is really powerful. This is a huge deviation from the timeline we know, and the impact of the planet's destruction is allowed to linger during Spock's subsequent captain's log, only for this to be topped off with the revelation of a romance between Spock and Uhura. It feels like a natural extension of the flirtation we've seen in the original series, but actually following through with it is again surprising and also exciting. And that's ultimately what keeps me coming back to this movie and why I rank it so highly among the other big screen outings. Even to this day, it feels fresh and daring in its style and creative choices. Yet at the same time, it really captured the feeling of Star Trek, the bonds of friendship between the characters, the colourful and lively universe full of strange new worlds, strange new life, and endless adventure. Even after so many years, every time I finish watching this movie, I'm left with a profound sense that anything is possible, and that to me is at the real heart of Star Trek. Leading up to Star Trek's release, Paramount made a huge marketing push for the movie. Tie-in comic books, video games, and merchandise blanketed store shelves and screens. This was combined with a viral marketing campaign inspired by the success of Cloverfield the previous year, also produced by J.J. Abrams, and this extra push definitely paid off. Star Trek debuted on the 7th of May 2009 in the United States, with a $79 million opening weekend, with an additional $35 million from overseas, for a worldwide opening of over $114 million. It was the biggest opening for a Star Trek movie in the US and internationally. It ended its US theatrical run in October of that year, having grossed over $385 million worldwide, the highest grossing Star Trek movie at the time. Critical and audience reception was likewise incredibly strong. It was acclaimed by critics, with aggregate website Rotten Tomatoes measuring a 94% approval rating, with the average review giving the film an 8 out of 10 score. Praise was heaped upon the lavish presentation, fast pace, and performances from the cast. Among the various hardcore Star Trek fan sites, the reception was a little more controversial, with some vocal detractors going so far as to call it a betrayal of the franchise and not quote-unquote real Star Trek. But to those detractors I say, even if you didn't like this take on Star Trek, it still introduced Star Trek to millions of new fans. When I announced this video on my community tab, a slew of commenters named this movie as the installment which got them into Star Trek. Even the quote-unquote real Star Trek. For the first time in a long time, Star Trek was a hit again, and for the first time ever, it was on the same footing as some of the franchises which often dwarfed it by comparison. The success continued on home video where DVD and Blu-ray sales topped the charts. It was even the first Star Trek film to win an Academy Award for Best Makeup, as well as a plethora of other accolades and nominations. Many Star Trek veterans also spoke positively about the movie. Patrick Stewart said, "I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was a very, very odd experience to be in the cinema watching a new Star Trek movie that I wasn't in. Not only that, but with the exception of Leonard Nimoy, I didn't know any of the cast. But it's Star Trek. They've taken some quite innovative decisions, but it's absolutely essential, right down the middle Star Trek." While some hardcore detractors voiced their disapproval online, for many Star Trek was a crossover hit. It was critically acclaimed, and the highest-grossing Star Trek movie at the time. Having become such a success, a sequel was inevitable. The question of whether the hot streak from 2009 could be maintained would be answered in 2013. In 2009, Star Trek made a triumphant return to the big screen, but Paramount Pictures was very pleased with Star Trek even before its release, and had already asked the creative team of J.J. Abrams, Brian Burke, Damon Lindelof, Roberto Orci, and Alex Kurtzman to produce a sequel. However, it took quite some time for the vision for this sequel to fully come together. Orci and Kurtzman returned to pen the script, this time joined by Lindelof. Building on the success of the previous film, the trio believed they needed a central villain for their story. While Nero had essentially become a fierce antagonist for Spock in Star Trek, this time the trio wanted an antagonist for Kirk, and naturally the conversation led to the character Khan Noonien Singh. Though using the character was discussed, the writers took a long time to commit to the idea, and struggled to find a suitable story to feature the character. The slow start to the film was further exacerbated by the team's own busy schedules. Kurtzman and Orci, between Star Trek movies, were also working on a Transformers sequel, the graphic novel adaptation Cowboys and Aliens, as well as continuing to produce the television show Fringe. Lindelof, after Star Trek, was busy winding down Lost, as well as working on Ridley Scott's Prometheus. Abrams, meanwhile, on top of his television work, had begun work on his next feature film, Super 8. This scheduling difficulty pushed back the sequel's release from an initial summer 2011 release to an eventual summer 2013 release. At first, the team discussed the fallout of Vulcan's destruction and how much that would be involved in the sequel, but Abrams and Lindelof were insistent that a sequel had to stand on its own. While the sequel would have its own plot separate from the previous film, however, the character arcs would need to continue. While Star Trek was about the crew coming together, the sequel would be about the crew growing and maturing, therefore they needed to be tested to the extreme. The sequel needed to go to a darker place and have a more powerful antagonist. This led the conversation back to Khan Noonien Singh. Roberto Orci said, "In a way, Damon and I were the biggest debaters about this. He argued for Khan from the beginning, and I argued against it." Lindelof said of Khan, "He had such an intense gravity in the Star Trek universe, we likely would have expended more energy to not put him in this movie than the other way around." Abrams recalled, "The fun of this timeline is arguing that different stories with the same characters could be equally if not more compelling than what's been told before. Certain people are destined to cross paths and come together, and Khan is out there, even if he doesn't have the same issues." Eventually, Orci and Lindelof were able to reconcile their differing opinions on Khan by recontextualizing his character as part of a larger plot, different to his original motivations. Orci said, "The antagonist's motives were based on his use by a corrupted system of power that held things he held dear against him and tried to manipulate him. That story stands alone with or without Star Trek history." Having seemingly cracked the idea for the sequel, casting the right actor for Khan was crucial. Though as part of the marketing efforts, Abrams' trademark mystery box secrecy made sure Khan's involvement in the story would be kept secret from audiences until the movie was released. Instead, Khan's in-universe cover of John Harrison was publicly stated to be the villain's identity. Actors considered for Harrison/Khan included Benicio del Toro, Edgar Ramirez, and Demian Bichir, but in the end, English actor Benedict Cumberbatch won the role. Cumberbatch had steady work on British television all throughout the 2000s, and had won critical acclaim on London's West End, but it was his role as Sherlock Holmes in the BBC's modern reimagining of the detective which made him a household name. Coupled with his roles in 12 Years a Slave and the Hobbit series, and Cumberbatch quickly became one of the most in-demand actors for Hollywood blockbusters and award-season dramas of the day. To explain Khan's noticeable change in ethnic appearance, the tie-in graphic novel Countdown shows Khan undergoing cosmetic surgery to better hide his identity. Also joining the returning cast members from the previous film were Alice Eve as Carol Marcus and Peter Weller as her father, Admiral Marcus. Having returned to retirement, the iconic Leonard Nimoy declined an offer to reprise the role of Spock for this sequel, but after an unsuccessful attempt by Abrams to secure involvement from William Shatner, Nimoy was convinced to return for a small cameo. By April, the first draft of the script had finally been completed, titled Star Trek Into Darkness, and after reading the script, Abrams chose to return to the director's chair following completion of Super 8. Virtually all of Abrams' collaborators from the previous film returned, including ILM visual effects supervisor Roger Guyot, director of photography Dan Mindell, and production designer Scott Chambliss. For Chambliss and the art department team, one of the most important tasks was redesigning the Klingons. The Klingons had originally appeared in a deleted sequence for the previous film, shown in intimidating costumes designed by Michael Kaplan, but the actual Klingons underneath the masks were never seen. For Star Trek Into Darkness, the creative team were determined to bring the Klingons back, as they had been absent for the previous movie. Chambliss worked closely with designers Neville Page and Dave Anderson to create the new look for the Klingons, their ships, weapons, and their homeworld Konos. Chambliss envisioned Konos as a bombed-out toxic wasteland. Due to the Klingons being so warlike and having fought each other, at some point they would have used chemical and nuclear weapons in their various conflicts. For the Klingons themselves, the designers kept the overall look, but added the idea of the distinctive forehead ridges snaking back over the head. They also added the cultural component of the piercings in the nose and ridges, suggesting the more badass the Klingon, the more piercings.
Now I am officially blinged out.
For the Klingon dialogue, linguist Mark Okrand once again lent his services to the production, inventing some new Klingon words and adjusting some of the pronunciations.
I guess no one can complain if this doesn't sound right to them.
Oh, they can complain. They'll definitely be able to complain, and I'll have to explain to them why it's right anyway.
Zoe Saldana, having previously learned Na'vi for James Cameron's Avatar, took to Klingon very easily.
Mech. Yes, mech. Rach v'shamech. Edge dodge me, which we truck kamech. Not there because poop.
Right.
Filming began on the 12th of January 2012, just as before the production shot at Paramount Studios and Backlot, as well as locations throughout California, and additional photography in Iceland. Also just as before, Abrams and Mindell opted to shoot Into Darkness on film rather than digital, this time mixing in IMAX footage as well as 65mm film for certain scenes. While not shot in 3D, the movie would be post-converted into 3D as was the trend at the time following Avatar. While previously the production used a Budweiser beer plant for the Enterprise's engineering, this time the production opted to instead use Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, with its experimental fusion reactor standing in for the Enterprise's main reactor. Other locations in the film, such as the Nibiru planet, Volcano, and Konos, were all either shot at the Paramount soundstages or Paramount backlot. During filming, a guest of the set, Edgar Wright, director of the acclaimed Cornetto trilogy, directed a single shot in the film. While he has never revealed which one, it was likely during the sequence on Konos. Principal photography wrapped in May 2012. Industrial Light and Magic returned to produce the visual effects for the film, assisted by Pixamondo and Atomic Fiction. The workload for the movie was enormous, with over 1,600 visual effects shots. The previous film had less than 1,000. The Enterprise was unchanged from its design in 2009, but this time new ships such as the USS Vengeance and the Klingon D-4 Scout Bird of Prey were also created in CG. While a practical set was built for the Volcano interior, almost all of this was replaced with an entirely digital environment. The Enterprise shuttle bay was also entirely digital. Composer Michael Giacchino also returned for Into Darkness. He carried over the same themes from his previous work, such as the main theme and Vulcan motifs. For Into Darkness, he created an original track for John Harrison, aka Khan, utilizing piano and heavy strings. For the Klingons, he created far more percussion-heavy tracks, layered with a men's choir chanting in Klingon. After a slow start in development, the much-anticipated sequel, Star Trek Into Darkness, was released on the 17th of April, 2013. It seems I open every other Star Trek movie retrospective with a line about this being a controversial entry in the franchise, and this is certainly true with Star Trek Into Darkness. Among the hardcore Trekkies, Into Darkness has bounced around people's rankings frequently, with some calling it the worst of the bunch, some naming it as their favourite, and others placing it somewhere in the middle. For me, Star Trek Into Darkness is a step down from the previous entry, but it's a film I still very much enjoy watching. Presentation-wise, everything I liked about the visual style and art direction of the 2009 Star Trek movie is back in Into Darkness. J.J. Abrams' slick but occasionally clumsy direction is back with just as much energy and grit as before, albeit with slightly less lens flare. Rather than repeating my previous thoughts on the visual style overall, I'll instead highlight the terrific art direction of this movie. I've said before that Into Darkness, in my opinion, has the best Klingon designs. That may be sacrilegious for some fans, but I absolutely love everything about this interpretation of the Klingons. Kronos being a bombed-out, irradiated wasteland is a radically different creative choice, but I think it's well justified. The Aztec ruin-like structures of the planet suit the cultural aesthetic nicely. I love the armor and helmets making these Klingons appear almost demonic, like animated skeletons come to life to attack their enemy. I also love the design philosophy for the USS Vengeance as this dark reflection of the Enterprise. All sharp angles rather than elegant curves. It's all functional and minimalist as opposed to the bright gleaming Enterprise. It's really terrific work. Michael Giacchino produces yet another strong Star Trek score for Into Darkness. His original theme for John Harrison is hauntingly beautiful and dramatic. The action cues on Kronos are especially great, propelling the fights and chases nicely, while also adding in texture with the Klingon chants. While Into Darkness may be even better looking and sounding than Star Trek 2009, I feel the script is much weaker. The inclusion of Khan is probably the most controversial aspect of the film for fans, and while it was a truly impossible task to follow the great Ricardo Montalban, I think Benedict Cumberbatch is fantastic in the role. However, his take on the character works largely because it's wisely not even attempting to copy what Montalban did with the character. Whereas Montalban's Khan was very theatrical, relishing each and every victory over his opponent, this version of Khan is in a much more desperate place, and Cumberbatch plays him with a lethal efficiency which can be truly scary. This Khan is always singularly focused on his objective, physically demolishing those who get in his way, and with Cumberbatch rattling off technobabble, exposition, and direct threats with a gravitas and speed which really convinces the audience of the character's great intellect as well as personal morality. Just like with previous Khan-centric stories, his character and the performance of the actor playing him overshadows the regular cast, who continue to be very strong. Pine and Quinto's Kirk and Spock are brilliant, with the two characters still developing the relationship we're familiar with, but in new and unexpected ways. Spock essentially betraying Kirk in the first act comes as a real shock. It shows us these characters are still learning how to be friends. But on the other hand, it's very gratifying to see Kirk's cavalier attitude to command get called out in this movie. I said before that in the previous movie, Kirk came across as too arrogant in a lot of scenes, and while his arrogance was tempered, it was never punished. But in Into Darkness, Kirk's assumption that he can think or fight his way out of anything is utterly destroyed, and Pine does a great job portraying that inner turmoil on screen. The other regular cast, just as before, don't get as rich character arcs, but they all get their moments to shine. Sulu taking command, Uhura staring down the Klingons, Scotty infiltrating the USS Vengeance, and so on. Newcomer Alice Eve also makes an impression as Carol Marcus, and Peter Weller has so much gravitas he can pull satellites out of orbit. In general, I would say the themes are also well explored from a narrative standpoint. It touches on similar ideas as Deep Space Nine's Homefront/Paradise Lost, fear of an outside threat leading to moral compromise. It all works well enough, and leaning into the War on Terror allegory makes revisiting these ideas very much relevant. What lets all of this down though is the messy plotting and ill-advised callbacks to older Star Trek entries. The twist of John Harrison actually being Khan is so obvious from the outset, and the delivery so nonsensical, it basically didn't need to be a twist at all. This version of Kirk has never met Khan before and likely has no idea who he is. This twist is only for the audience, and so it has no real impact on the story. If this character had simply been called Khan from the very beginning, it wouldn't really change anything. Repurposing elements from The Wrath of Khan also has very mixed results. Flipping the death scene so Kirk dies in the radiation chamber rather than Spock is clever to some degree, and the scene is very well acted. However, personally, all I can think while watching the scene is how it's a remix of The Wrath of Khan. Recognizing the overt reference to a previous Star Trek movie within this one stops me from getting caught up in the emotion. It distracts from the scene rather than enhances it. And while the plot contrivances in the previous film were forgivable for the most part, here there is some truly clumsy writing. While a lot of the internet nitpicking has exaggerated these flaws, the criticisms surrounding the portable transwarp beaming device and Khan's magic blood curing death are emblematic of bigger problems in the script. The Enterprise pursuing Khan to Kronos is fine, but having him beam directly from Earth to the Klingon homeworld is pretty silly. Reverse engineering advanced medicine from Khan's genetically enhanced blood is also fine, but having Bones discover this right in the middle of the Vengeance blasting the shit out of the Enterprise feels incredibly forced. Ironclad plot logic is only one component of a successful movie, and oftentimes so-called plot holes can be overlooked, but Into Darkness is simply very messy and clunky, to the point where I can understand some viewers being taken out of the story altogether. For me though, the overall story does work, but I feel like the script needed another draft to iron out some of these kinks. And that's a sentiment which pretty much sums up my general feelings on the film. By no means is Star Trek Into Darkness a disaster or even outright bad. It's an enjoyable sci-fi action-adventure romp with some thrilling sequences, spectacular visual effects as well as solid character writing and compelling narrative themes. It's a fun movie to watch, but it does fall short of its predecessor. While Benedict Cumberbatch puts in an excellent performance, ultimately I think Khan's inclusion in the story and the mystery box marketing surrounding him was a mistake. It creates a lot of problems in the script, and the attempts to solve them muddy the waters with regards to the stronger elements in the film. I can totally see why some viewers felt repulsed or even angry at the movie, but personally I think a lot of Into Darkness's faults have been blown out of proportion over the years. Many would argue we should expect far more from a Star Trek movie than a turn your brain off action film, but to that I'd say Star Trek has been far worse than that. Star Trek Into Darkness is still pretty good, but it should have been great. Following the smash success of Star Trek 2009, Star Trek Into Darkness's reception was a bit more of a mixed bag. While it would go on to outgross the previous movie, reaching over $460 million worldwide, becoming the highest grossing Star Trek movie ever on a budget of $190 million, it's unclear if these box office numbers actually met studio expectations. Then again, studio expectations may have been enormously high. A lot of this is speculation on my part, but I believe Paramount Pictures wanted Star Trek Into Darkness to be their Dark Knight to Star Trek 09's Batman Begins. Remember at the time these movies came out, the model for blockbuster franchises was not an interconnected cinematic universe, but auteur-director-driven trilogies. We had Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Michael Bay's Transformers, and Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight. Just like Batman Begins, Star Trek 09 was seen as a return to form for franchises which were previously seen to have devolved into irrelevancy or self-parody. Therefore, when Batman Begins, which did almost identical box office numbers to Star Trek, was followed by a darker sequel pitting its title character against his most well-known antagonist and went on to gross over $1 billion, it's easy to see why Paramount may have thought Into Darkness would perform just as well. Which is the reason why the whole mystery box secrecy surrounding Khan being in the film is such a misstep. It made the film worse and potentially prevented as much hype being generated for the sequel as was warranted. Reflecting on Into Darkness years later, J.J. Abrams said, There are a number of characters we could have used, and a number of issues that we talked about in terms of Khan, and one of them was, why do that? Why bring him back? We've established a brand new timeline, we could do anything we want. Let's just do something brand new. While ostensibly Star Trek Into Darkness was a success at the box office and with critics and wider audiences, the pop culture legacy of the film is difficult to parse. Among hardcore Trekkies, the movie is often derided in certain circles, but then again some do name it as one of, if not their outright favourite Star Trek movie. It's a mixed bag, not the triumphant follow-up to Star Trek's winning comeback many would have hoped it would be. Nevertheless, Star Trek was still a popular brand, and thus a third film in the Kelvin Timeline was quickly underway. However, the legacy of the resulting movie may be even more difficult to discern than its predecessor. Leading up to the release of Star Trek Into Darkness, Paramount Pictures were anticipating another hit on their hands, and so had already greenlit another Star Trek movie. This time around, Paramount wanted to avoid the long development of Into Darkness, and insisted on a 2016 release to coincide with Star Trek's 50th anniversary. While J.J. Abrams returned as producer with his Bad Robot production company, he was unable to direct due to his commitments to Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens. The first pitch for the next movie came from Zack Stentz and Ashley Edward Miller. Details on their pitch are scarce, but it involved a noble antagonist similar to the Romulan commander in Balance of Terror, as well as a Dyson sphere containing some kind of ancient Lovecraftian force which could threaten the galaxy. While Abrams and Paramount fielded more pitches from various writers, several directors were considered for the job, including Rise of the Planet of the Apes director Rupert Wyatt and Attack the Block director Joe Cornish. Wyatt was unavailable and Cornish turned the job down. By December 2013, Roberto Orci, Patrick McKay, and J.D. Payne were the ones chosen to write the next Star Trek feature film. The team's goal was to return to a sense of exploration, with the Enterprise some time into its famous 5-year mission. During the development of the screenplay, Roberto Orci also petitioned Paramount to direct the film himself, making it his directorial debut. Paramount was hesitant to give such a large project to a first-time director, but eventually they approved. However, as work on the screenplay continued, Paramount grew dissatisfied with the script and demanded heavy rewrites. Due to these creative differences, all 3 writers would end up leaving the project, and Orci would also depart as director in early December 2014. The short list of replacement directors included Scott Pilgrim vs. the World's Edgar Wright, Headhunters director Morton Tildum, and Source Code director Duncan Jones. Star Trek veteran Jonathan Frakes also expressed interest, but ultimately Justin Lin, known for the crime drama Better Luck Tomorrow and the blockbuster Fast and Furious movies, landed the job. Justin Lin was a fan of Star Trek since early childhood and was thrilled to helm the movie. This love for the franchise was also shared by Simon Pegg, and the two quickly began developing the script for the movie. Lin wanted to create something totally new for the next movie, saying, "The Klingons, Romulans, and other species are great, but it's time to go further. It has been fun to focus on creating whole new worlds and species." Simon Pegg first coined the title of the film in recognizing that Lin wanted to take Star Trek beyond. Joined by Doug Jung, the trio of Trekkies approached Paramount to come up with a new script, and Paramount approved. Simon Pegg said, "I felt like it was important to really deconstruct the idea of Star Trek, the idea of the Federation and why it's so special. We'll really be poking at quite a lot of different ideas. We're gathering a great community within the galaxy, but to what end? What does it all mean?" All of the regular cast would return, however Alice Eve's Carol Marcus would not feature in the film. Pegg explained that they simply couldn't come up with anything worthwhile for the character to do, and so she was dropped. A new addition to the cast was Sophia Boutella as Jayla. Jayla was largely inspired by the character Ree Dolly from the drama Winter's Bone. It was lead actress Jennifer Lawrence's nickname J-Law which inspired the name Jayla. Boutella was a trained dancer for most of her early career, using these skills to break into film in Street Dance 2 and Street Dance 3D. Her first major acting role was as the deadly henchwoman Gazelle in Matthew Vaughn's Kingsman: The Secret Service. For the villain of the movie, the writers came up with the character of Krall. On Krall's creation, Justin Lin said, "If we really want to deconstruct what the Federation means, we need to have an antagonist with a valid point of view. It can't just be someone twirling their moustache." For the audience, when they hear Krall's reasons, they might not agree with them, but they have to accept it's a valid point of view. One side posed Simon and Doug that challenge, and we were really trying to come up with ideas to deconstruct it. I thought they did a great job of writing and creating Krall. Justin Lin's top choice to play the character was Idris Elba, as although Krall would have very little screen time, Lin knew Elba could command every scene he was in and leave a real impression on the audience. Lin met with Elba to discuss the role and conversed for hours about the character. In the end, Elba signed up for the part, despite some concern over the 4-hour-long makeup process. Idris Elba's first big break was in the HBO series The Wire, in which he portrayed Stringer Bell. In his native England, though, his most famous role was as foul-tempered detective Luther. On the big screen, Elba was no stranger to science fiction, having appeared in Ridley Scott's Prometheus, as well as Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim. Also joining the cast was Indonesian action star Joe Taslim as Manis and Lydia Wilson as Kalara. Much later during reshoots, Shohreh Aghdashloo, most famous for portraying Christian Avasarala in The Expanse, also joined the cast as Commodore Paris. Although initially set to start filming in April 2015, this was pushed back to June 2015. But as prep was underway to start production, the cast and crew were met with some deeply sad news. After a long battle with chronic illness, the legendary Leonard Nimoy passed away on the 27th of February 2015 at his home, surrounded by his friends and family at the age of 83. Following the news, cast and crew who had worked alongside him gave personal tributes online. William Shatner wrote, "I loved him like a brother. We will all miss his humor, his talent, and his capacity to love." Among many other cast tributes, Zachary Quinto, who had become a close friend to Nimoy, said, "My heart is broken. I love you profoundly, my dear friend, and I will miss you every day." Beyond the Star Trek veterans, many other public figures paid tribute, with US President Barack Obama saying, "He was a lifelong lover of the arts and humanities, a supporter of the sciences, generous with his talent and his time." Former NASA astronaut Buzz Aldrin called him a fellow space traveler because he helped make the journey into the final frontier accessible to us all. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory paid tribute to the actor by renaming an asteroid discovered in 1988 4864 Nimoy after him. Paramount, during a promotional event, named a street on their studio backlot outside the stage where the original series was filmed, Leonard Nimoy Way. To really get a sense of the man's great legacy, I'd highly recommend the truly touching documentary For the Love of Spock, directed by Leonard Nimoy's own son Adam Nimoy. It's rather fitting that for a character often chastised for his cold logic, Spock, and by extension Leonard Nimoy, was seen by so many as the real heart of Star Trek.
We lost Leonard during the writing process, and immediately we thought, well, we have to pay tribute, and the most obvious way felt to have Leonard Spock join him and communicate our sadness at losing Leonard through the sadness of losing the Spock that we all know and love.
I think he would have been very proud and grateful and probably a little bit embarrassed. But I think in the end, it's a fitting tribute to him.
I know what it meant to him to be a part of this world, and to have been part of that legacy is an honor for all of us.
Live long and prosper.
Filming began on the 25th of June 2015. Rather than basing the production in California as had been done with all previous Star Trek movies, Star Trek Beyond was primarily filmed in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Additional photography also took place in Dubai and Seoul, South Korea. This time around, the Enterprise sets were built on massive gimbals to tip and shake the sets for real, rather than the usual shaky cam trick Star Trek usually used.
Action. Lieutenant, there's There's so many weird noises on. Sound like shit broke.
While the bridge and Kirk's quarters were fully practical, many of the other sets such as corridors and engineering were only partially built, extended using visual effects. Many locations throughout British Columbia were used for the planet's surface, including the Squamish Boulders and Pitt River Quarry, which stood in for Krall's base. Several massive outdoor sets were built at Vancouver Film Studios' backlot, including the wrecked Enterprise saucer section and outer hull of the USS Franklin. For the interior of Starbase Yorktown, the production moved to Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, where the Jumeirah Lakes Towers and Maiden Racecourse were used among other locations. While inside Yorktown, the film would also showcase a number of new aliens. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, the art department and makeup team worked together to create 50 new alien designs for the movie alone.
Because many films now move into the CG world, it's a very hard responsibility to be able to pull this off.
Right. It's monumental, the amount of work that, this crew is generating. The most complex is the character Natalia. In so many pieces, there's so much exposed alien skin. She's got this giant nautilus-shaped head, she's got a back piece, a chest piece, she's got shoulder pieces, she's got full exposed arms, and the size of this head, it's enormous.
We had different heads, like his most alien, like his transformation head.
The makeup changes, but still keeping some of the signature physical traits in the face that the original Krall makeup had, and you can see the relation.
I'd never done prosthetic works as deeply as that, so I lent into the puppetry of it and just threw myself into that space.
With Jayla, there was a very conscious effort to make her distinct, to make her iconic. And the elegance of the lines on that makeup, I think, is really what makes it stand out. That combined with the hairstyle.
I've never done prosthetic before. I like that second skin. I like what it brought to me. It's like, as soon as I had it on, you feel in character. I wouldn't feel anywhere near it if I didn't have it on.
Principal photography wrapped in October 2015, with some reshoots the following year in March. For the visual effects of the film, industrial light and magic were unavailable, and so instead the work was split between double negative and atomic fiction with assistance from Kelvin Optical and Rodeo effects. This time around, the Enterprise underwent a slight redesign. The overall style was kept the same, but the ship was made a tad slimmer and the nacelle pylons were changed so they arced back rather than straight up. However, the Enterprise would largely be upstaged in the film by Starbase Yorktown, designed by Sean Hargreaves. Michael Giacchino returned for his third Star Trek score. As this film was commemorating Star Trek's 50th anniversary, Giacchino decided to include some more overt references to past Star Trek music. While his own original themes from the previous installments return, he also made sure to include deliberate homages to the work of Alexander Courage, Jerry Goldsmith, and James Horner. Complementing Giacchino's score was an original song to promote the film and close out the credits, Sledgehammer co-written and performed by Rihanna, who was a huge Star Trek fan from an early age. The post-production process for Star Trek Beyond was intensive, involving a team of 4 editors and Justin Lin allegedly only sleeping in 3-hour bursts. The finish line was in sight, but only a month before the film's release, the cast and crew were struck with another tragedy. On the 19th of June, actor Anton Yelchin was found dead at his Los Angeles home, the victim of a freak car accident. He was only 27. Tributes from cast members, friends, family, and colleagues soon emerged. By all accounts, Yelchin was a deeply intelligent and kind person, whose talents promised a bright future ahead. Among the tributes, the fan community of the MMORPG Star Trek Online created a memorial plaque for Yelchin alongside late Star Trek figures Leonard Nimoy, James Doohan, DeForest Kelley, and Gene Roddenberry. In October 2017, a bronze statue was erected at his grave.
It is a bittersweet morning because, 1, we're here with Anton, we're here for Anton, and 2, he's not here with us. But it really alleviates my heart to know that we're gonna keep him alive. We're gonna keep all that he was full of, which was life.
we're going to keep remembering that in hopes that by practicing all the things that he believed in and remembering all the love that he gave us and all the joy that he gave us the short time that he was with us, that we're able to just keep him here with us.
I'm grateful every day that I'm on set. This is what I do, and I love it very much, and I'm always with my friends, and it's been the loveliest thing. I'm so grateful because there's such good people, and there's so much fun to be around, and they make me happy.
For the finished film, Justin Lin and J.J. Abrams dedicated Star Trek Beyond to the memories of both Leonard Nimoy and Anton Yelchin. The movie was released on the 22nd of July, 2016. When it comes to ranking this era of Star Trek movies, Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Beyond keep switching places as to which one is my favourite. Either way, Star Trek Beyond is easily one of the best big screen outings for the franchise, a colourful, action-packed adventure which successfully balances the pulpy fun with thematic exploration. It's certainly as flashy as the previous two films, but Justin Lin and Stephen F. Winden lend the movie their own unique visual style. The handheld camera, Dutch angles, and lens flares are all gone. Instead of the grittiness J.J. Abrams gave his Star Trek films, Star Trek Beyond is sleek and vibrant. I love how much more colourful this movie is, especially the redesigned warp effect. I love these big sweeping or twisting camera moves throughout the film. The way the Enterprise is shot is so different and innovative compared to the previous movies. Just like with Star Trek 2009, this is Star Trek viewed through a brand new lens, and it's most welcome. There's also lots to like when it comes to the art direction. I think this version of the classic uniforms are far more successful than the preceding films. The slightly slimmed down Enterprise brings it closer to its original silhouette, and Starbase Yorktown is simply spellbinding to look at. Michael Giacchino's score is similarly exceptional. All three of his Star Trek scores are great, but this one might be my favourite. I love the little references to previous composers, and there's plenty of arresting new themes as well. The Arrival at Yorktown track is just stunningly beautiful. The main theme is also worked into many of the action sequences nicely, especially during the destruction of the Enterprise. It's frankly difficult to come up with new things to say about this score which doesn't also apply to the previous two, but Giacchino's work on Star Trek has comfortably resulted in three of the best soundtracks in the entire franchise. As well as a visual revamp, this time around the characters have gone through a change as well. Chris Pine's Kirk has moved past his juvenile arrogance and is now much closer to the seasoned captain of the original series. This film essentially completes a larger arc this version of Kirk has been going through since the first movie. Star Trek 2009 saw Kirk stepping up to the plate to live up to his potential, Into Darkness saw him confront the realities of command, and Star Trek Beyond sees Kirk truly commit to the ideals of Starfleet and the Federation on his own terms. It's really satisfying to see Pine portray a more matured Captain Kirk, though his stint riding a dirt bike still shows as he has that rebellious spirit at heart. In contrast to Kirk, I feel like Kral is quite an underrated character among the pantheon of Star Trek villains. Idris Elba does what he does best in presenting us with a character with a tough outer shell, but a more sympathetic core. The twist of Kral in fact being a former Mako turned Starfleet captain is pretty damn effective and turns a generic alien brute into a tragic figure. My only gripe with the character is that we don't get to see more of him. There's a lot of dramatic material to exploit with Balthazar Edison, but this movie only scratches the surface. While some Trek fans balked at the idea of a director known for the Fast and Furious films helming this movie, Beyond showcases his talents for revealing character through action. While Kirk may take center stage, the whole ensemble is used well. Spock and McCoy get some of their best scenes together in this movie, packed with plenty of laughs and heartfelt moments. And while Chekhov, Uhura, Sulu and Scotty don't have as much to do dramatically, they never feel idle. They're always active in the plot, discovering new clues as to Kral's larger plan, or providing invaluable help to the main trio. Jayla partly steals the show from the regulars though. She's a terrific character with a breakout performance from Sofia Boutella. Her design is instantly iconic and she is resourceful, courageous, but also funny and endearing. Essentially a child who has been forced to grow up too fast, with her own compelling character arc woven into the film. The narrative themes aren't as clearly signposted as previous Trek films, but they're just as rich. This is a story which really examines the core ideals of the bright future Star Trek presents us with. Edison's greatest flaw is his inability to imagine the very future Star Trek depicts. For him, humanity is one set thing, and changing that is truly terrifying to him. And while this fear is acknowledged, Kirk himself unsure of the end goal of his 5-year mission, the events of Beyond ultimately demonstrate the strengths of diversity, of learning from one another and working together. The miraculous starbase Yorktown serving as the symbol of Federation peace and prosperity. These ideas are explored primarily through the plotting and visuals rather than long moralizing speeches, but it's just as effective. It's also fitting to re-examine these ideas for Star Trek's 50th anniversary. Thankfully, the other callbacks never spiral into shallow fan service and instead exist in the film as touching tributes to Star Trek's larger legacy. Folding in Leonard Nimoy's passing into the in-universe death of Spock and the parting gift to the original cast photograph is sincerely moving. While I think Beyond could have done with another editing pass to slow its breakneck pace for all its story beats to properly land, overall this is a fantastic big screen outing for the franchise and a fitting commemoration of the 50th anniversary. It's a bright and colourful outer space thrill ride, boasting some incredible action set pieces and visual spectacle. But it's also an earnest celebration of the Star Trek legacy, driven by a great cast of characters, both regular and newcomers. This was really what I wanted out of a Star Trek movie for years. For a franchise which is characterized by going boldly, exploring strange new worlds, and seeking out new life, most Star Trek movies largely confine themselves to political plots taking place inside the Federation. Star Trek Beyond is really the only film which actually charts brand new territory, and gives us that blockbuster version of an original series episode we Trekkies have been clamoring for. This is a large part of why Star Trek Beyond is my go-to Star Trek movie. While entries like The Wrath of Khan are arguably better written and directed, for me Beyond perfectly embodies that spirit of adventure which first captured my imagination as a child better than any other big screen outing. Which is why, despite its flaws, this is easily one of my favourites. Upon release, Star Trek Beyond was met with a positive reception from critics and audiences. Praise was given to the film's visuals, action, and characterization. Beyond was also well received by Star Trek fans in general, with even some of the previous film's detractors being won over by its TOS vibe. Unfortunately, however, this positive reception did not translate to box office success. The marketing campaign for the movie was widely criticized. The initial teaser trailer was far too fast-paced and reliant on action rather than emphasizing the story. The destruction of the Enterprise is just thrown up on screen, given no dramatic weight as it should have been. The second trailer, while much better, was released only 2 months before the film's debut. It felt more like a mad scramble to snag moviegoers than a coordinated campaign. The fan event at Paramount Studios was well received, but the My Star Trek Story videos in which random celebrities talked about their love for Star Trek generated little interest, and later TV spots even spoiled the twist of Krall actually being human. The release date was also extremely crowded, placing the movie in direct competition with Ghostbusters, Jason Bourne, and Suicide Squad. A September release, actually closer to the 50th anniversary date, would have been much less crowded. There was also a feeling of the film's thunder having been stolen somewhat. In the previous video I mentioned how this series of Star Trek movies began at a time where auteur-director-driven blockbuster trilogies were all the rage. But by 2016, the movie landscape had transformed. Every major studio was now chasing the interconnected cinematic universe. Many moviegoers in 2016 were saving their money for the highly anticipated Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice and Captain America Civil War, coupled with the overwhelming hype for Star Wars' return to the big screen, and Star Trek Beyond was effectively left in the lurch. On a $185 million budget, Star Trek Beyond grossed $343 million worldwide. When marketing and other costs are factored in, it's estimated the movie lost around $50 million. That being said, Star Trek movies have been in this position before with much worse box office numbers and a far more negative critical and audience reception. In fact, positive word of mouth has led to strong home media sales for the movie since its initial release. The possibility of a dedicated audience still being out there is a big reason why a fourth entry in the Kelvin Timeline movie series has been in development ever since Beyond's release. At the time of writing, tentative plans for Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and the other cast members to return for a fourth film have only just been announced. It's yet to be seen how all of this will pan out. Thank you for watching. Leave the video a like, and if you want to stay up to date on future uploads, hit the subscribe button and bell icon. You can also see videos early, uncut, and ad-free by joining me on Patreon. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank all of my patrons and members with an ultra thanks to Ian Feebig, Alex Miller, Eamon Kelly, Michael Hardy, Ian Hodge, County Ark, Mike Halsey, Retro PC Gamer, Benjamin Stokes, Hiroshi the Dog, Movie Magic, Charles Borsam, Olivia Computer, Bano, Extreme Streamers, Tom, Dusk, Colin Camille, Patrick Fleming, Matthew Camille, Ed Mark Starr, Dylan Thomas, Lilac Yane, Howard Craig Kervik, and Caging G. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, have a good one.